spend some of my time in our office in Hong Kong and the rest of the time traveling around our other offices in the region. So I'll be moderating this session, which I think will be quite an interesting session, looking at market-based mechanisms and also having some discussion leading on from the last discussion in this room about the private sector as well. Let me start by introducing our provocateur and the rest of the panel. Next to me is Mireille Atala. She's the regional team leader for the Arab states for UNDP Bratislava Regional Center in Slovakia. Next to her is Koli Rao, head of product development and reinsurance, the Agriculture Insurance Company of India. Next to him is Thomas Mahl, Innovative Solutions Manager for Munich Re in Singapore. Next to him, we've got Rajesh Kalra, Managing Director of RMSI in India as well. And last but not least, Dr. Ramani, Director of the Indian Institute of Natural Resins and Gums. So I'm going to hand over to Mireille, who's going to give a short presentation and then ask our other panelists to respond to that presentation for about 5 minutes each, and then we'll open it up to comments and questions from the floor. Mireille.
Good afternoon, everyone. I've been asked to give this presentation as a provocateur, and with the blessing of the moderator, I've tried to really live up to that attribute. What I would like to cover here first is the general setting and why are we talking about market-based mechanisms. Essentially, if we look at the negotiations framework, the negotiations text, references to market-based mechanisms, and in particular to risk transfer, risk sharing mechanisms, have gone from 3 references in 1992 in the original text to 53 references in the latest text that was being negotiated right after Copenhagen. We have several submissions coming from the Alliance of Small Island States related to insurance, to risk transfer and risk sharing. And there was a submission also related to insurance coming from MCII, the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, that was tabled in front of the to the delegates in their negotiations. Now, if we look at it from an economic perspective, there is also a rationale for talking about market-based mechanisms over and beyond ODA. And in particular, if we look at the need in LDCs and middle-income countries, this is where the highest toll is paid in terms of economic impacts, but also human impacts from climate hazards. And this is also, as you can see in the pie charts on the right-hand side, this is where losses are least insured, and therefore where there is probably the largest scope from a market perspective, but also from a coverage perspective and benefit for the people. Now, where we are today is essentially we're in a very reactive mode rather than being in a very proactive mode. And the resource gap estimation map essentially shows that several economies may in fact collapse if faced with certain climate hazards. Now, these are only for extreme weather events. The question also applies to slow onset events, for which unfortunately I don't have economic estimates here. But we do have estimated costs for adapting to climate change, and there are many different estimates that have been done in the past few years. Now, these are annual costs estimated in billions of dollars, and today all the climate funds, the vertical funds, and also the bilateral funds that are going into adaptation to climate change represent less than 1% of the need for financing. If we also look at the Copenhagen Accord, In terms of fast start financing, we're talking about around 10 billion per year, both for mitigation and adaptation. And if we look at the long-term financing, the estimates are, what's been tabled, is 100 billion per year. So we're for both mitigation and adaptation. So from a public finance perspective, it really falls short from the needs for financing for adaptation, and there's a whole rationale here for involving the private sector and for broadening the sources of financing. So what I would like to do here now, having grounded this in the intergovernmental process, is essentially to look at what are the big questions. From my perspective, the very first one is to ask whether or not climate risk management is equivalent to adaptation. Is it sufficient to climate-proof development, climate-proof investment, to say that we're doing adaptation? That's probably a question that the technical people might answer, but I think is important from a private sector and market perspective. The second question is, will the market or the private sector pay for adaptation? And there are several ancillary questions to that, which I will touch upon. And the third question is, what is needed? What are the investments that we need to do? What is the enabling framework that we need to put in place before we can move towards market-based mechanisms for adaptation? Now, thinking about it, I really wonder whether or not there are market-based mechanisms for adaptation, because if you look at the literature so far, it's mostly related to taking out proceeds of the carbon market and reinvesting them into adaptation, such as the Adaptation Fund. That's the way it operates today. Are there real market-based mechanisms for adaptation, and what would they be? If we try to answer the question of what is needed, what we hear from the private sector recurrently is that there is a need for strong, stable, coherent, and credible national policies as a prerequisite to the private sector investing in any country, be it for adaptation or for any other thing. We heard this morning the lady from CSR also mentioned the fact that the signals that are being sent to the private sector in terms of lack of political commitment around climate change are not conducive for private sector investments in that area. So be it at a national or at a global level, the strong political commitment is one of the prerequisites. Do we have it, and what is needed to get to it? The second point is the data ownership issue. A lot of investments in climate change, for climate change adaptation, essentially have a lot of uncertainty associated with them, because we are talking about climate impacts on the long term, and we are talking about hazards, we are talking about slow onset events. We don't really know what is going to happen. We know what is the trend, but when is it going to happen, and what really is going to, what are the real impacts going to be, are a question. And who owns the data is another one. When a government sets up, or when we need meteorological stations, and when they are set up by the private sector because they provide the data and information needed by the private sector, does it own the data, or is that data that is of a public good and therefore needs to be in the public domain? From a private sector perspective, what are the risk returns characteristics? And is adaptation bankable from a private sector perspective? If we look at renewable energy, energy efficiency, there is a certain level of return on investment that probably meets the requirements of private sector in order to move forward these investments. Do we have the same characteristics? Are investments in adaptation able to meet the same kind of return on investment requirements? And the last question is, should public finance support the creation of enabling environments for investment, or should we prioritize actions that have immediate impacts? Now, this is a question that's going around in the climate change circles, in the climate change community. Should the public finance for climate change help set up the systems and the enabling environment that will enable the private sector invest and become active? Or should public finance essentially go towards actions on the ground that have immediate benefits. Some consider that if we were to invest public money, public dollars in setting up the environment, then the enabling environment, then that would equate to subsidizing the private sector. Question. Now, if we look at the general debate on climate change, insurance is essentially one of those private sector or market-based mechanisms that is most prominent in the discussions in terms of market-based mechanism for adaptation. And what I've tried to do here is to lay out some of the questions that have been going around within the climate change community, both from the public sector, the private sector, multilateral organizations, beneficiary governments, developing countries, and others. And essentially, I think that one of the big questions is the who pays question and who should pay question. Who should help set up the systems and the structures to enable insurance to operate? Should it be the public funding, like the MCII and AOSIS proposal, that are tabling a 10 billion public fund to enable insurance, the deployment of insurance? Or does that equate to distorting market rules and therefore should not be pursued? Another question, prominent question, is what's in it for the industry? You hear a lot of discussions around in terms of critiques, essentially saying that if public financing was to go towards insurance, that the insurance industry is in fact the highest profit-making industry globally, and that the industry is only pursuing this area because it's going to open up a lot of business for it, and therefore because it's going to be making much more profit. Now, what's in it for the industry? And I hope that Thomas is going to be able to answer that question, as well as our colleague from India. Now, if we zoom into index insurance, which has been having a lot of, receiving a lot of interest in the past few years, and we at UNDP, together with Columbia University and other partners, have produced a publication looking at best practices and, or rather stock taking, looking at what is the state of affairs vis-a-vis index insurance. Now, is it true that index insurance essentially provides or will enable a broader range of adaptation actions? Will it really enable access to credit, which is one of the proposals that is tabled? How easy is it to identify and correlate indices? And are we really talking about long-term adaptation, or are we rather talking about short-term coping with current vulnerability rather than long-term climate change impacts? And lastly, just broadening up the picture again, some of the questions that have been going around are what are the contributions of market-based mechanisms? What benefit do they bring? Is it true that market-based mechanisms, and for example setting up cost recovery mechanisms for hydromet stations or hydromet networks, is it true that this will strengthen climate monitoring networks? One of the big problems, in particular in Africa, is that you have a lot of monitoring stations that have been set up, but for which public budget or public finance is not available to enable operations and maintenance, and so they collapse. If they were tied, if data monitoring was tied to a private sector or to a market mechanism, would it enable this longer-term financing for operations and maintenance? Is it true that market-based mechanisms essentially provide additional flexibility for decision makers? Again, if we take the case of, let's say, West Africa, where climate change scenarios essentially project increase in rainfall, then a decrease in rainfall, then again an increase in rainfall. What should decision makers do about that? What sort of infrastructure can cope with both of these droughts, inundations, and then droughts? And if they had financial mechanisms available, would that give them additional flexibility in terms of their investments in infrastructure? And lastly, one of the claims is that market-based mechanisms will essentially allow a stronger predictability of financing. Is